Sometimes the question that changes your life comes from the person you least expect. Brett Holloway had spent most of his adult life answering questions. As the founder and chief executive officer of Holloway Technologies, he spoke at conferences, investor meetings, and leadership seminars across the country. Reporters asked about innovation. Shareholders asked about growth. Employees asked about the future. After years in the public eye, there was very little that could surprise him, or so he believed. On a bright Friday morning in Charlotte, North Carolina, Brett arrived at Meadowbrook Elementary School as the featured guest for the school's annual Career Inspiration Day. The event brought local professionals together with students to encourage them to dream about their futures. The gymnasium buzzed with excitement as hundreds of children filled the folding chairs arranged across the polished floor. Colorful banners decorated the walls. Teachers guided students into orderly rows while parents and volunteers moved through the crowd. Brett smiled politely as the principal introduced him. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, he walked onto the small stage and began speaking about perseverance, education, and the importance of believing in possibilities. The children listened attentively. Some took notes. Others watched with wide eyes as he described building a company from a small office into a successful technology firm. The presentation lasted nearly 40 minutes. As he reached the end, the principal opened the floor for questions. Dozens of small hands shot into the air immediately. Brett answered inquiries about computers, business, and leadership. The atmosphere remained light and cheerful. Then he noticed a boy seated near the middle of the audience. Unlike the others, the child had remained unusually quiet throughout the event. He appeared to be around 8 years old. Thoughtful eyes, calm expression, a notebook resting on his lap. Something about him stood out, though Brett could not explain why. The boy slowly raised his hand. The principal nodded toward him. He stood carefully and held the microphone with both hands. For a moment, it seemed as if he might ask about technology or entrepreneurship like the others. Instead, his voice carried across the silent gymnasium. Do fathers ever come back after they leave? The room instantly became still. Even the teachers looked surprised. Brett felt the question strike him with unexpected force. It was simple, honest, painfully human. He opened his mouth to answer, but found himself searching for words. The boy was not asking about business. He was asking about hope. Brett studied the child's face. There was no anger there, only curiosity, as though he genuinely wanted to understand. After a long pause, Brett finally spoke. Sometimes they do, he said gently. And when they realize what truly matters, they try very hard to make things right. The boy nodded quietly and sat down. The event continued, but Brett found it difficult to concentrate. His thoughts repeatedly returned to that single question. When the assembly ended, students began filing out of the gym. Brett shook hands with teachers and accepted a few photographs. Then, across the room, he noticed the same boy walking toward the exit beside a woman. The moment he saw her face, the world seemed to stop. 8 years disappeared in an instant. Standing beside the child was Danielle Carter, the woman he had once called his wife. For several seconds, Brett Holloway could not move. The noise of the gymnasium faded into the background as his eyes remained fixed on the woman standing beside the boy. Danielle Carter looked older than she had 8 years earlier, but the kindness in her face was unchanged. The same warm eyes, the same quiet grace. Memories he had spent years trying to bury returned all at once. Their first apartment, weekend road trips, shared dreams about building a future together. Then came the painful ending that had shattered everything. Danielle noticed him immediately. A brief look of surprise crossed her face before she quickly composed herself. Neither smiled. Neither spoke. The years between them felt too large to cross with a simple greeting. Ethan stood beside his mother, unaware of the storm quietly unfolding between the two adults. He adjusted the strap of his backpack and glanced curiously between them. Brett felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. Questions flooded his mind. Why was she here? Why had she disappeared all those years ago? Why did seeing her still affect him this deeply? Before he could say anything, a teacher approached Danielle to discuss an upcoming school project. The brief interruption broke the moment. Danielle thanked the teacher, then gently placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Come on, she said softly. The boy nodded. As they turned toward the exit, Brett finally found his voice. Danielle. She stopped walking. Slowly, she turned back. The expression on her face was calm, but her eyes revealed emotions she was trying hard to hide. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Brett took a step forward. "I did not expect to see you here." Danielle offered a small nod. "Neither did I." Her voice sounded exactly as he remembered. That somehow made everything harder. Ethan watched the exchange with growing curiosity. "Mom, do you know him?" The question seemed innocent enough, but it landed heavily between them. Danielle hesitated. Brett noticed it immediately. "Yes," she finally answered. "We knew each other a long time ago." Ethan accepted the explanation and looked toward the hallway where several classmates were waiting. Like most children, his attention quickly shifted elsewhere. But Brett could not ignore what he had just witnessed. Something felt different. Strange. Unsettling. Danielle looked exhausted for a brief moment, as though carrying the weight of years no one else could see. "I should go," she said quietly. Brett nodded, though he wanted to ask 100 questions. "Can we talk sometime?" Danielle lowered her eyes briefly before answering. "I do not think that would be a good idea." The response hurt more than he expected. Yet before he could reply, Ethan returned to her side. Together, they walked toward the parking lot. Brett remained standing inside the gymnasium long after they disappeared from view. Later that evening, he sat alone inside his penthouse overlooking the Charlotte skyline. The city lights shimmered beneath the darkness, but he barely noticed them. His thoughts remained fixed on the encounter. One detail continued replaying in his mind. The timing. Ethan appeared to be around 8 years old. 8 years. The same number that marked the end of his marriage. Brett stood and walked toward a cabinet where old personal documents were stored. Deep inside one drawer rested a photograph from another life. A wedding picture. He stared at it silently. 8 years ago, he had believed Danielle chose to walk away forever. Yet after seeing her again, something felt wrong about the story he had accepted all these years. And for the first time, he found himself wondering whether the truth had ever been the truth at all. The past has a strange way of returning when people least expect it. For Brett Holloway, the days following the school event became increasingly difficult to ignore. He attempted to focus on business as usual. Meetings filled his calendar. Investors expected decisions. Product launches demanded attention. Yet no matter how busy he remained, his thoughts repeatedly drifted back to Danielle Carter and the boy standing beside her. Something about the encounter refused to leave him alone. Late one evening, after most employees had gone home, Brett sat alone in his office overlooking downtown Charlotte. The city lights stretched across the horizon while silence filled the room. On his desk rested the old wedding photograph he had pulled from storage days earlier. He stared at the image for a long time. 8 years ago, he had believed he understood exactly why his marriage ended. His mother, Evelyn Holloway, had been the one who delivered the devastating news. Danielle was pregnant, she had said, but she did not want the baby. She had decided not to continue the pregnancy and wanted to move on with her life. The conversation had shattered him. At the time, he was building his company and spending endless hours at work. He knew he had not been the perfect husband, yet he never imagined Danielle would make such a decision without speaking to him directly. When she left shortly afterward, the story seemed confirmed. Eventually, he stopped searching for explanations and accepted the painful version of events he had been given. But now, for the first time in years, cracks had appeared in that narrative. The memory felt different. Incomplete. The more he reflected on those final months of their marriage, the more details seemed wrong. Danielle had always been honest, compassionate, family-oriented. The idea that she would make such a life-changing choice without even one conversation no longer aligned with the woman he remembered. Across town, Danielle sat at her kitchen table helping Ethan finish his homework. The small house felt warm and comfortable. Family photographs lined the shelves. Children's drawings decorated the refrigerator. To anyone looking from the outside, it appeared to be an ordinary evening. Yet Danielle could not stop thinking about seeing Brett again. For years, she had carefully built a life around moving forward. She focused on teaching. She focused on raising Ethan. She focused on creating stability. Revisiting old wounds had never been part of the plan. Ethan looked up from a math worksheet and smiled. The man from school seemed nice. Danielle paused. "You think so?" Ethan nodded. He listened when people talked. Most adults pretend to listen. Danielle could not help smiling at the observation. It sounded remarkably mature for an 8-year-old. "Maybe you are right," she replied. Later that night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Danielle opened a small storage box tucked away in her closet. Inside rested several photographs, old letters, and a folded document she had not touched in years. Her eyes settled on a hospital record dated 8 years earlier. Painful memories resurfaced immediately. The arguments, the confusion, the unanswered questions. Most of all, the conversation that never happened. Danielle had spent years believing Brett chose not to fight for their family. Meanwhile, Brett had spent those same years believing she chose to leave. Neither knew that someone else's words had quietly shaped both of their lives. As rain began tapping softly against the windows, two people sat in separate homes carrying the same realization. Somewhere inside the story they had both accepted, an important piece of the truth was still missing. Certain questions become impossible to ignore once they take root in the heart. During the weeks that followed, Brett Holloway found more reasons to return to Meadowbrook Elementary School than he cared to admit. Officially, Holloway Technologies had launched a new educational initiative that provided computers and technology resources to local schools. Unofficially, Brett wanted answers. The program gave him opportunities to visit classrooms, meet teachers, and observe students participating in academic projects. Each visit brought him into the same orbit as Danielle Carter and Ethan. At first, their interactions remained polite and brief. Danielle maintained professional boundaries. She thanked him for supporting the school and focused on her responsibilities as a teacher. Brett respected her distance, but he could not ignore what he continued to notice whenever Ethan was nearby. One afternoon, the school hosted a science fair in the cafeteria. Parents and community members wandered between displays while students proudly presented their projects. Brett stopped at Ethan's table and studied a model city powered by renewable energy. The project was remarkably detailed for an 8-year-old. "Did you build this yourself?" Brett asked. Ethan nodded. "My mom helped me organize the materials, but the design was mine." Brett smiled. "You thought through every detail." Ethan shrugged modestly. "I like figuring out how things work." The answer sounded familiar. Too familiar. Brett remembered hearing the exact same phrase from his own father when he was young. As the afternoon continued, he found himself watching Ethan interact with classmates. The boy listened carefully before speaking. He preferred solving problems over arguing. He asked thoughtful questions and noticed details that others overlooked. More than once, Brett felt as though he were watching a younger version of himself. Across the room, Danielle noticed it too. She saw the growing curiosity in Brett's eyes. She saw the connection neither of them dared name aloud. The realization filled her with equal parts fear and sadness. For years, she had prepared herself for many possibilities. This moment had always been one of them. A few days later, another school event brought them together again. Students were participating in a community service project at a local park. Ethan volunteered to help organize donated books for a neighborhood reading program. Brett joined the event as a sponsor. Throughout the morning, he worked alongside the children. At one point, Ethan struggled to assemble a display shelf. Before Brett could offer assistance, the boy carefully examined the pieces, adjusted the angles, and solved the problem on his own. The solution was identical to one Brett himself would have chosen. The observation lingered in his mind long after the event ended. That evening, Brett returned home carrying an uncomfortable mixture of emotions. Curiosity had evolved into suspicion. Suspicion had begun transforming into something deeper. He opened an old photo album containing childhood pictures from his family home. The similarities felt increasingly difficult to dismiss. A certain expression, a particular smile, even the way Ethan tilted his head while concentrating. None of it proved anything. Yet together, the details created a question he could no longer silence. Meanwhile, Danielle sat at her kitchen table watching Ethan finish his reading assignment. The boy looked up suddenly. "Mom, why does Mr. Holloway always seem interested in what I am doing?" Danielle paused. Her heart tightened. "Maybe he thinks you are a special kid." Ethan smiled and returned to his book. Danielle looked away before he could see the emotion gathering in her eyes. Somewhere deep inside, she knew the moment she had feared for 8 years was drawing closer. And neither she nor Brett would be able to avoid it much longer. The truth often waits patiently until people are finally ready to hear it. For Danielle Carter, that moment arrived sooner than she expected. The growing connection between Brett Holloway and Ethan had become impossible to ignore. Every school event, every conversation, every shared moment seemed to pull them closer together. What frightened her was not the possibility that Brett would discover the truth. What frightened her was how much time had already been lost. One evening after a parent-teacher conference, the school building had nearly emptied. The hallways were quiet. The last rays of sunlight stretched through the classroom windows. Danielle gathered papers from her desk when a familiar voice spoke from the doorway. "We need to talk." She looked up and found Brett standing there. His expression was calm but determined. Danielle knew immediately that avoiding the conversation was no longer possible. Several minutes later, they sat across from one another in the empty school library. The silence between them carried the weight of 8 years. Brett spoke first. "I have spent weeks trying to understand what happened." Danielle lowered her eyes. "So have I." Brett leaned forward slightly. "The story I was told never made sense after seeing you again." His voice softened. "I need to know the truth." Danielle took a slow breath. For years she had imagined this conversation. Yet now that it had arrived, finding the right words felt impossible. Finally, she opened the folder she had brought with her. Inside were old documents she had kept all these years. Medical records, letters, notes from another lifetime. "I never chose to end my pregnancy," she said quietly. Brett froze. The words landed like a shockwave. Danielle continued before fear could silence her. "I never wanted to leave you either." Confusion filled his face. "Then why did you disappear?" Tears gathered in her eyes. "Because I believed you did not want us." Brett stared at her in disbelief. Danielle explained everything. She described the final weeks of their marriage. The conversations she never understood. The messages that never reached her. The day Evelyn Holloway visited her apartment while Brett was away on business. Danielle could still remember every word. Evelyn had insisted that Brett wanted to focus on building his company. She claimed he was not ready to become a father. She warned Danielle that staying would only create resentment and disappointment. At the same time, Brett had been told an entirely different story. He was led to believe that Danielle had rejected both the marriage and the child. Two people who loved each other had been separated by lies neither realized existed. Brett listened without interrupting. With every detail, the foundation of the past 8 years began to collapse. Memories suddenly looked different. Conversations carried new meaning. Questions finally had answers. When Danielle finished speaking, the room fell silent. Brett looked down at the documents spread across the table. His eyes settled on a medical record dated shortly after their separation. The date matched perfectly. The timeline matched perfectly. Everything matched. Emotion filled his voice when he finally spoke. "All these years." Danielle nodded. Tears rolled down her cheeks. "All these years." Brett closed his eyes briefly. The realization was devastating. Not because Danielle had lied to him, because she had not. Somewhere beyond the library windows, the evening sky darkened. Inside, two people sat facing the truth for the first time, and neither of them would ever see the past the same way again. Some discoveries bring joy. Others bring regret, so deep that words cannot fully contain it. In the days following their conversation in the school library, Brett Holloway found himself carrying a weight unlike anything he had experienced before. The truth had finally emerged, yet instead of bringing relief, it forced him to confront everything he had lost. 8 years of birthdays, 8 years of school projects, 8 years of bedtime stories, holidays, victories, disappointments, and ordinary moments that make up a childhood. 8 years of being a father without ever knowing it. For the first time in his life, success felt insignificant. A week later, Danielle agreed to meet him again. This time, the conversation centered on Ethan. They sat together at a small cafe near the school while the afternoon sun filtered through the windows. Brett spoke honestly. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not offer excuses. He simply acknowledged the truth. "I cannot change what happened," he said quietly. "But I do not want to lose any more time." Danielle studied him carefully. Over the years, she had imagined many versions of this moment. Some filled with anger, others with disappointment. Yet what she saw now was neither. She saw a man grieving years he could never recover. "Ethan deserves honesty," she finally said. Brett nodded. "I agree." Together they decided to move slowly and carefully. Ethan's well-being would remain the priority. No sudden revelations. No overwhelming changes. Trust would be built one step at a time. The opportunity arrived sooner than expected. A few days later, Ethan participated in a Saturday morning soccer game. Danielle invited Brett to attend. Standing along the sidelines among parents and families, Brett felt unexpectedly nervous. It was such an ordinary event, yet it carried enormous meaning. Throughout the game, Ethan glanced toward the crowd several times. Each time he noticed Brett watching, a small smile appeared on his face. After the match ended, Ethan jogged over holding a participation ribbon. "Did you see my goal?" he asked excitedly. Brett smiled. "I saw it. You played incredibly well." Ethan's face brightened. The simple praise seemed to matter more than Brett realized. Over the following weeks, moments like that began to accumulate. Brett attended science fairs, school assemblies, and community events. Sometimes he helped Ethan with homework at the kitchen table. Other times they spent an afternoon building model airplanes or discussing technology. The connection developed naturally. Neither forced it. Neither rushed it. One evening, while working together on a school project, Ethan asked a question that caught Brett by surprise. "Did you always know what you wanted to do when you grew up?" Brett laughed softly. "Not even close." The conversation continued for nearly an hour. As Ethan listened, Brett recognized familiar expressions, familiar curiosity, familiar determination. The resemblance extended far beyond appearances. It lived in the way Ethan thought, the way he approached challenges, the way he viewed the world. Eventually, after careful discussions with Danielle and guidance from a family counselor, the truth was shared. Ethan listened quietly as the adults explained everything. There were tears. There were questions. There was confusion. But there was also understanding. More than anything, there was relief. The mystery that had existed in the background of his life finally had an answer. Later that evening, after the conversation ended, Ethan sat beside Brett on the back porch. The sunset painted the sky with soft shades of gold and orange. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Ethan looked up at him. "So you are really my father?" Brett felt emotion rise in his chest. "Yes," he answered softly. Ethan smiled. Not a dramatic smile. Not a surprised smile. Simply a happy one. "I was hoping that might be true." In that moment, Brett realized that while he could never recover the years they lost, a new chapter had finally begun. Love is not proven by a single grand gesture. It is proven by showing up when no one is watching. After learning the truth about his father, Ethan's life did not change overnight. He still attended the same school. He still completed homework at the kitchen table. He still spent weekends playing soccer and building science projects. What changed was the growing presence of Brett Holloway in the spaces that mattered most. For Brett, every moment felt precious. He understood that trust could not be purchased, accelerated, or demanded. It had to be earned, one ordinary day at a time. The following months became a season of rebuilding. Brett adjusted his schedule in ways that surprised his executive team. He declined unnecessary speaking engagements. He reduced business travel whenever possible. He created space for school concerts, parent meetings, weekend activities, and family dinners. At first, some colleagues questioned the changes. Brett simply smiled and continued making the same choice. For the first time in years, he knew exactly where his priorities belonged. Ethan noticed everything. He noticed when Brett arrived early to watch a soccer practice. He noticed when Brett remembered details from previous conversations. He noticed when promises were kept. One Saturday morning, they spent several hours assembling a telescope from a science kit. The process required patience and teamwork. More than once, pieces ended up in the wrong place. Yet instead of becoming frustrated, they laughed through the mistakes and kept going. When the telescope was finally finished, Ethan looked through the lens and grinned. "We actually did it." Brett smiled. "You did most of the work." Ethan shook his head. "We did it." The simple correction meant more than Ethan realized. Across the room, Danielle quietly witnessed the exchange. Every day, the wall she had built around her heart became a little smaller. Not because Brett asked her to trust him, because his actions consistently gave her reasons to. One evening, the school hosted an academic awards ceremony. Ethan received recognition for outstanding achievement in science and mathematics. As he walked onto the stage, he searched the audience. In the front row sat Danielle and Brett side by side. The sight brought an unexpected smile to his face. Later that night, he carefully placed the certificate inside a frame. Then he added a new photograph beside it. The picture showed all three of them together after the ceremony. Danielle noticed it a few days later and felt tears forming in her eyes. The image represented something she had once believed was impossible. Meanwhile, Brett continued learning that fatherhood was built from countless small moments. Early morning breakfasts before school, helping with difficult assignments, listening to stories about classmates, encouraging dreams, offering support after disappointment. None of it appeared in business magazines. None of it generated headlines. Yet those moments became the most meaningful achievements of his life. One afternoon, while walking home from a community event, Ethan looked up at Brett and asked, "Why do you keep coming to everything?" Brett smiled softly. The answer felt simple. "Because you matter to me." Ethan considered the response for a moment before nodding. "Good. Because I like having you there." The words settled deeply in Brett's heart. Years earlier, he had measured success through contracts, profits, and expansion. Now success looked completely different. It looked like a child smiling after a soccer game. It looked like family dinners filled with conversation. It looked like belonging. And with every passing day, the family that had once been separated by misunderstanding was becoming stronger than either of them had ever imagined possible. The truth has a way of bringing hidden wounds into the light, not to cause more pain, but to finally allow healing to begin. As autumn settled over Charlotte, life had become calmer for Danielle Carter, Ethan, and Brett Holloway. The uncertainty that once surrounded their relationship had slowly been replaced by trust. Yet one chapter of the past remained unfinished. The misunderstanding that destroyed their marriage had never been fully confronted. Neither Danielle nor Brett spent much time discussing Evelyn Holloway anymore. For years, both had carried separate versions of the same story. Now that they knew the truth, neither felt driven by anger. What they wanted was understanding. One Sunday afternoon, Brett visited his mother at her home outside the city. The large house looked exactly as he remembered from childhood. The same garden, the same front porch, the same family photographs displayed throughout the hallways. Yet as he walked through the familiar rooms, everything felt different. He was no longer the ambitious young man who accepted every word without question. He was now a father who understood what had been taken from his family. Evelyn greeted him warmly and invited him into the living room. At first, their conversation remained ordinary. They discussed work, health, and family updates. Eventually, Brett placed an old photograph on the coffee table. It was a picture from his wedding day. Evelyn immediately recognized it. Silence filled the room. "I know what happened," Brett said gently. There was no accusation in his voice. No anger. Only sadness. His mother lowered her eyes. For several moments, she said nothing. Then the truth finally emerged. Years earlier, Evelyn had believed she was protecting her son. Brett's company was struggling. Financial pressure consumed every part of his life. She worried that the responsibilities of marriage and parenthood would overwhelm him. Instead of trusting him to make his own choices, she tried to control the outcome. Conversations were manipulated. Messages were withheld. Assumptions became decisions. What began as misguided protection eventually became a tragedy that separated a family. Tears filled Evelyn's eyes as she spoke. "I thought I was helping you." Brett listened quietly. "I know. I never imagined it would lead to this." The regret in her voice felt genuine. Years of guilt had clearly followed her as well. Brett took a slow breath. The pain remained real. Nothing could return the birthdays he missed or the years Danielle carried alone. Yet holding on to resentment would not change the past either. "We all lost something," he said softly. "But I do not want Ethan growing up surrounded by old mistakes." A week later, Danielle agreed to meet Evelyn. The conversation was difficult but respectful. There were apologies. There were tears. There was honesty that should have existed years earlier. Most importantly, there was accountability. No one attempted to rewrite history. No one pretended the damage had not happened. They simply acknowledged the truth. In the months that followed, something remarkable happened. The weight of the past began to lift. Ethan gained not only a father, but also a grandmother who genuinely wanted to be part of his life. Family gatherings slowly replaced years of distance. Laughter returned to spaces once filled with regret. One evening, as they sat together around a dinner table crowded with conversation, Danielle looked across the room and noticed something she had not seen in a very long time. Peace. Not perfect circumstances. Not a perfect history. Simply peace. And for the first time since her marriage ended, she allowed herself to believe that the future might hold more happiness than heartache. 1 year later, the question that had changed everything returned in the most beautiful way possible. The annual Career Inspiration Day had arrived once again at Meadowbrook Elementary School. The gymnasium looked much the same as it had the year before. Colorful banners decorated the walls. Students filled rows of folding chairs. Teachers moved through the crowd with welcoming smiles. Yet for Brett Holloway, Danielle Carter, and Ethan Carter, everything felt different. They sat together in the front row, not as strangers connected by unanswered questions, but as a family that had fought its way back to one another. Throughout the past year, life had continued to unfold in ordinary but meaningful ways. Family dinners became traditions. Weekend outings became memories. School projects, holidays, birthdays, and quiet evenings filled the spaces that had once been occupied by regret. Brett no longer measured success through business achievements alone. His greatest accomplishments now included helping Ethan prepare for science competitions, attending soccer games, and being present for the moments that mattered. Danielle watched the transformation with gratitude. The man sitting beside her was no longer someone from her past. He was part of her future. As the event began, the principal welcomed students and parents before inviting several outstanding students to share short presentations. When Ethan's name was announced, Brett and Danielle exchanged proud smiles. Ethan walked confidently onto the stage carrying a note card. He looked older now, more self-assured, more comfortable with who he was. Standing before the audience, he spoke about perseverance, kindness, and the importance of never giving up on people. The audience listened attentively. Then, during the question and answer session, a younger student near the back of the gymnasium raised his hand. The principal nodded toward him. The boy stood and asked, "Do fathers ever come back after they leave?" The entire room grew quiet. Danielle felt her heart stop for a moment. Brett looked toward Ethan. The same question, the same words. Yet everything had changed. Ethan smiled gently before answering. He looked toward the front row where his mother and father sat together. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Then he turned back toward the audience. "Sometimes they do," he said. "And when they do, they can become one of the best parts of your life." The gymnasium remained silent as Ethan continued. People make mistakes. Sometimes they do not know the whole truth. Sometimes they lose their way. But if they come back with honesty, love, and a willingness to stay, amazing things can happen. Brett felt emotion fill his chest. Danielle reached for his hand. Around them, parents quietly wiped away tears. When the event ended, students flooded the gymnasium with laughter and conversation. Ethan ran toward his parents and wrapped his arms around both of them. Together they walked outside into the warm afternoon sunshine. The school building stood behind them while children played across the lawn. Brett glanced at Danielle and smiled. She smiled back. There were no more secrets, no more misunderstandings, no more years lost to silence. Ahead of them stretched a future built on truth, forgiveness, and love. As they walked toward the parking lot together, Ethan slipped his hands into theirs. And for the first time in a very long time, every member of the family felt exactly where they belonged.